An elderly woman reached for her groceries, her hands shaking, when a man's mocking voice shattered the calm. "Hurry up! You're holding everyone back!" Shoppers stared, phones recording, but no one stepped in. That's when a hooded figure walked forward, pulling back his hood. It was Snoop Dogg. The grocery store was alive with the familiar hum of a busy afternoon. Shoppers maneuvered their carts through narrow aisles, the squeak of wheels blending with the faint sound of upbeat background music. Bright fluorescent lights cast a clinical glow over rows of neatly stacked produce, canned goods, and freshly baked bread. The store smelled of citrus cleaners and warm pastries, a mix that felt both welcoming and impersonal. Among the crowd was a figure few would immediately recognize: Snoop Dogg. Dressed in a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and sunglasses, he moved through the aisles with a casual grace, keeping a low profile. His baseball cap was pulled low, obscuring his unmistakable features. For once, he wasn't Snoop the superstar. He was just another shopper picking up groceries. He enjoyed the rare anonymity, savoring the freedom to blend into the crowd. At the entrance, Ellen Carter shuffled in, her cane clicking softly against the tile floor. In her late 70s, Ellen was dressed simply, wearing a pale cardigan and well-worn shoes. Her movements were slow but steady, and she clutched a crumpled shopping list in her free hand. Her face, lined with age, carried a quiet warmth, though her eyes revealed a hint of fatigue. As she made her way to the canned goods aisle, Ellen paused to scan the shelves. She stretched her arm toward a can of soup on the top shelf, but couldn't quite reach it. She looked around, hoping for assistance, but the other shoppers either didn't notice or chose to ignore her. A few feet away, Snoop glanced at her, his expression thoughtful as he considered stepping in. Unbeknownst to both, trouble was brewing nearby. Ellen Carter continued to struggle, her fingers just shy of the can she needed. Her soft, murmured sigh was nearly drowned out by the clatter of a nearby cart. She was a fixture in the neighborhood, known to many for her warm smiles and kind words. But here in the grocery store, she was just another elderly woman trying to make her way. A few aisles over, Snoop Dogg moved with practiced ease, his hood pulled low. He casually placed a loaf of bread into his basket, his sharp eyes scanning the aisles more out of habit than necessity. He noticed Ellen almost immediately, her quiet demeanor and struggle standing out against the bustling crowd. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to step in, but something made him stay put, watching instead. Nearby, John Sanders entered the scene. Middle-aged, with a stocky build and a perpetual scowl, John exuded an air of impatience. He was dressed in khaki slacks and a rumpled shirt, the type of outfit that screamed indifference. His posture was tense, his grip on the cart tight as he muttered about people wasting time. His sharp eyes landed on Ellen, and he sneered, his expression twisting with disdain. John's loud grumbling drew some attention, but most shoppers quickly averted their gaze. As Ellen stepped back from the shelf, frustrated by her inability to reach the can, John chuckled audibly. "If you can't handle shopping, maybe you shouldn't be out here," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Ellen froze for a moment, her shoulders stiffening. She glanced in his direction but quickly turned back to the shelf, trying to ignore him. Snoop, however, caught every word. His jaw tightened beneath his hood, and his hand paused over the cereal box he was about to grab. Ellen took a deep breath and tried again to reach the can, but her hands shook slightly. John rolled his eyes and muttered something else under his breath, his tone laced with irritation. The tension in the air thickened as Snoop shifted slightly, his instincts telling him to stay alert. The storm brewing in that quiet aisle was just about to unfold. Ellen Carter kept her focus on the shelf, ignoring the man's muttering. She stretched again for the can of soup, her fingers trembling. A store clerk nearby noticed her struggle and quickly came over to help. "Here you go, ma'am," he said with a polite smile, handing her the can. "Thank you," Ellen said softly. her voice kind but weary. Before she could place the can in her basket, John Sanders scoffed loudly. "Taking forever over one can of soup," he muttered, shaking his head. His tone was sharp, meant to be heard. "Some people need to learn how to move faster." Ellen looked down, gripping the handle of her cart tightly. She turned to leave the aisle, but John wasn't done. As she passed by him, he moved his cart just enough to block her way. "Excuse me," she said politely, trying to push her cart around his. John smirked. "Maybe you should stay home next time if you can't keep up," he said, his words dripping with mockery. At the other end of the aisle, Snoop Dogg stopped browsing and looked up. He could hear the man's voice now, the way it cut through the usual store noises. He saw Ellen hesitate, clutching her cart like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Snoop stayed still for a moment, his hood casting a shadow over his face. He didn't want to jump in too quickly, but every muscle in his body told him to keep watching. A young couple walking past glanced at the scene but quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. The tension in the aisle grew heavier, the air thick with unease. Snoop's jaw tightened as he made a silent decision to stay close. Ellen tried to move past John Sanders, her grip on the cart tightening as she avoided his gaze. But John wasn't done. He stood firmly in her way, blocking the narrow aisle with his cart. "In such a rush, aren't you?" he sneered, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads. "People like you always think the world revolves around them." The words stung. Ellen stopped and looked at him, her face lined with disbelief. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice shaking. "You heard me," John replied, smirking. "Taking up space, wasting time. Some of us have places to be." Ellen blinked, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't used to this kind of treatment, especially in public. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the few shoppers nearby quickly turned their attention to their carts or phones. At the end of the aisle, Snoop Dogg leaned against a shelf, watching the scene unfold. His sunglasses couldn't hide the sharpness in his eyes as he scanned the situation. He could feel the frustration building in his chest, but he didn't move yet. John took a step closer to Ellen, his tone growing more mocking. "What's in that bag? You carrying bricks or something? No wonder you're moving so slow." He laughed, his voice echoing down the aisle. A couple of younger shoppers smirked nervously, but no one dared to speak. Ellen tried to maneuver her cart around John, but he shifted to block her again. "Where are you going, huh?" he sneered, his grin widening. "Can't handle a little conversation?" Snoop clenched his fists under his hoodie. He stepped forward slightly, his tall frame casting a shadow over the aisle, but he held back for a moment longer. Ellen's voice wavered as she said, "Please let me through. I just want to finish my shopping." "Then hurry up," John snapped, leaning in closer. Snoop finally took another step forward, his voice low but firm. "That's enough." The entire aisle went silent, all eyes turning toward him. Snoop Dogg stood at the end of the aisle, his sharp eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Under the brim of his cap, he watched Ellen, her small frame trembling as she clutched her cart. John's loud, mocking voice carried down the aisle, grating against Snoop's nerves. From where he stood, Snoop could see the way Ellen's hands shook as she tried to steady herself. She glanced around, looking for help, but every nearby shopper seemed frozen. Some avoided eye contact altogether, quickly pushing their carts away while others whispered quietly to each other. John laughed again, his smug voice cutting through the tension. "What's wrong? Don't like the truth?" he jeered, leaning slightly toward Ellen. Snoop's jaw tightened as his fists curled in his hoodie pockets. For a moment, Snoop scanned the aisle, waiting to see if anyone else would step in. A young couple at the far end hesitated but didn't move. A man with headphones turned the corner, glanced at the commotion, and quickly walked away. The silence of the bystanders only made the scene feel heavier. Snoop took a slow, deliberate step forward, his tall frame immediately catching John's attention. "Hey," Snoop said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the man's laughter. "That's enough." John turned, his smirk fading as he sized up the man now standing behind him. The onlookers began to murmur softly, sensing a shift in the air. Snoop pulled his sunglasses down slightly, meeting John's gaze directly. "Who are you?" John asked, his tone wavering slightly. Snoop didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, standing tall and unflinching. "Someone who's not about to let you keep acting like this." The aisle grew quiet as Snoop Dogg stepped closer. His calm yet commanding presence shifted the mood completely. Ellen looked up, her worried eyes meeting Snoop's steady gaze. For the first time, she felt the weight of the moment ease just a little. John Sanders hesitated, the smirk on his face faltering. "You're really stepping in for her?" He scoffed, but there was a trace of nervousness in his tone. "Mind your own business, man." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his voice low but sharp. "She is my business now. You gonna back off? Or do we have a problem?" John glanced around, realizing that several shoppers were now watching intently. Phones were coming out, cameras pointed toward the scene. He straightened, trying to regain his swagger. "I don't need this," he muttered, waving his hand dismissively. But instead of leaving, he planted himself stubbornly in the middle of the aisle. Ellen moved her cart slowly, hoping to slip past, but John stepped in her way again. "See? No big deal," he said loudly, addressing the onlookers. Snoop's expression hardened. He stepped right into John's personal space, his voice dropping to a growl. "You think this is funny? You're done here. Move out of her way." The tension crackled in the air, the silent crowd now glued to the confrontation. John's bravado crumbled under Snoop's unwavering stare. For a moment, he looked as if he might argue, but something in Snoop's calm intensity made him step back. Ellen pushed her cart forward, her voice trembling. "Thank you," she said softly. Snoop didn't break eye contact with John. "Apologize," he said firmly. The aisle went completely silent. The tension in the aisle was thick as Snoop Dogg stepped closer to John Sanders, towering over him with calm but unrelenting authority. Ellen stood just a few feet away, clutching her cart tightly as she tried to collect herself. The quiet murmurs of bystanders filled the air, their phones now raised to capture what was happening. Snoop adjusted his hood slightly, pulling it back just enough for his face to become more visible. "You need to stop," he said, his voice steady but sharp. John's smirk returned, though it wasn't as confident as before. "Who do you think you are, man?" he said with a forced laugh, waving dismissively. "This is none of your business." Snoop took another step forward, closing the gap between them. "It's my business when you're disrespecting this lady," he said firmly, motioning toward Ellen. "You think you can talk to her like that and walk away? Not today." John glanced around, noticing the growing number of phones pointed at him. His posture stiffened as he tried to regain control. "Relax, man. It was just a joke," he said, raising his hands defensively. "Nothing about this is funny," Snoop replied, his tone unflinching. Ellen, her voice trembling but determined, said softly, "Please, let's not make this worse. I just want to go." Snoop looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said gently, before turning back to John. The crowd watched as John shifted uneasily, his fake bravado cracking under the weight of Snoop's presence. "Fine," John muttered, taking a small step back. "I didn't mean anything by it." But Snoop wasn't done. "Apologize to her," he said, his voice calm but commanding. John hesitated, looking at the crowd and then at Ellen. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Snoop's eyes narrowed. "Say it like you mean it." John Sanders stood frozen, his face twisted with frustration. He glanced at the growing crowd, now silently watching him, phones raised and recording every moment. The air was heavy with anticipation as Snoop Dogg stood firm, his presence commanding the aisle. "I already said sorry," John muttered, his voice low and irritated. Snoop didn't move, his sharp gaze cutting through John's weak attempt at defiance. "You call that an apology?" Snoop asked, his tone calm but firm. "Say it again. This time, mean it." Ellen stood behind her cart, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. The crowd around them grew larger, with people from other aisles filtering in. A few whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible. "Man, this is ridiculous," John said, his voice rising as he waved his arms in frustration. "Why don't you just mind your own business?" Snoop took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "You think it's ridiculous to treat people with respect?" he said, his voice steady and commanding. "You don't talk to her, or anyone, like that. Not while I'm here." The crowd murmured louder, some nodding in agreement. John's confidence began to waver. "Look, I don't want trouble," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Then stop making it," Snoop replied instantly, his words cutting through the noise. One of the bystanders, a woman holding her phone, suddenly called out, "Why don't you just leave her alone?" Her words were a ripple in the tense silence, and a few others nodded in agreement. John glanced around, realizing the crowd wasn't on his side. His bravado started to crumble, but he tried one last time to save face. "Whatever, man," he said, backing up slightly. "I didn't mean anything by it. People overreact to everything these days." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving John's. "Overreacting? Nah, what's happening here is accountability, and you're not walking away until you've done right by her." John shifted nervously, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he turned toward Ellen, avoiding her gaze. "I'm sorry," he muttered again. "Swing this time louder." Ellen nodded, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Thank you," she said softly. Snoop didn't move, standing like a sentinel, ensuring John wouldn't try anything else. The tension in the aisle slowly began to ease, but the moment wasn't over yet. Ellen stood there, her eyes reflecting a mix of relief and gratitude. The harsh lines of worry on her face softened. She took a slow breath, steadying herself after the tense encounter. Turning to Snoop Dogg, she offered a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice sincere but a bit shaky. "You didn't have to step in like that." Snoop shook his head lightly. "Yes, ma'am, I did. No one should be treated that way." She nodded, her hands still gripping her cart. "People usually just look away," she murmured. "It's rare to find someone willing to stand up." Around them, the crowd began to disperse slightly. Some shoppers lowered their phones, looking a bit embarrassed. A young woman nearby cleared her throat. "I'm sorry," she said to Ellen. "I should have said something sooner." Ellen gave her a warm smile. "It's all right, dear. The important thing is that kindness won out in the end." Snoop glanced around at the onlookers. "We all gotta look out for each other," he said, his voice carrying a message meant for everyone. "Can't just stand by when something's wrong." A middle-aged man stepped forward. "You're right," he admitted, his eyes downcast. "I was afraid to get involved. I won't make that mistake again." Ellen reached out and patted his arm gently. "We all learn," she said kindly. "Today was a lesson for many of us." She turned back to Snoop, her eyes studying him more closely. "You seem familiar," she said thoughtfully. "Have we met before?" Snoop smiled modestly, pulling his hood a bit lower. "Maybe we've crossed paths," he replied. "But today, I'm just glad I was here." She chuckled softly. "Well, whoever you were my guardian angel today." He shrugged lightly. "Just doing what's right, ma'am." A store manager approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, glancing between Ellen and Snoop. Thanks to this gentleman, yes, Ellen replied, her voice regaining strength. But you might want to train your staff to handle situations like this better. The manager nodded quickly. Absolutely, we'll make sure of it. And please, if there's anything we can do... Ellen smiled. Just keep an eye out for your customers. Snoop offered her his arm. May I help you with the rest of your shopping? Her face brightened. I'd appreciate that very much. They began to walk toward the checkout lanes, the crowd slowly returning to their own tasks, but clearly affected by what had happened. A few shoppers nodded respectfully at Ellen and Snoop as they passed. As they moved away, Ellen looked up at Snoop with gratitude. You've restored my faith in people today. He glanced down, his eyes kind. Sometimes we all need a reminder, he said softly. As Snoop and Ellen walked toward the checkout, the energy in the store began to shift. The murmurs from earlier had turned into quiet conversations, with shoppers reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Snoop could feel the weight of their gazes on his back, but he wasn't looking for recognition. His focus was on Ellen and the message this moment carried. He paused near the register, turning briefly to address the crowd that had gathered earlier. His calm but firm voice carried through the space. What happened today shouldn't have even started, he began, his tone steady. But when it did, y'all saw it. Some of you recorded it, some of you laughed, and most of you just stayed quiet. A few people shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes while others nodded in agreement. It's easy to pull out a phone or look the other way, he continued, his gaze moving across the room. But the truth is, standing up takes more than that. It takes courage. It takes action. Ellen looked up at him, a quiet pride in her expression. Next time, Snoop said, his voice firm, don't just watch. Step up, because someone out there needs you to have their back. His words settled over the room, resonating deeply with those listening. A man near the back of the crowd raised his hand slightly, his voice soft but resolute. You're right. I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry for that. Snoop nodded. Apology's a good start. Now let's all do better. Ellen smiled at the onlookers and said, kindness costs nothing, but it makes all the difference. With that, Snoop turned back to Ellen, gently guiding her toward the cashier as the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying his words with them. John Sanders stood near the entrance of the grocery store, his face flushed with frustration and humiliation. The store security guard, alerted by a staff member, approached him with a calm but firm demeanor. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, the guard said. John scowled, crossing his arms defiantly. Leave? For what? I didn't do anything wrong. Snoop Dogg, who had just helped Ellen with her final items at the checkout, turned toward the commotion. His tall figure, still commanding the room, made John stiffen. You didn't do anything wrong? Snoop repeated, his voice steady but sharp. You disrespected that lady, blocked her path, and tried to make her feel small. And now you don't want to take responsibility? The security guard nodded. We've received complaints about your behavior. This store has a zero-tolerance policy for harassment. John's voice rose as he gestured toward the onlookers. This is ridiculous. All I did was talk to her. You people are blowing this out of proportion. Snoop took a step closer, his eyes locking onto John's. You didn't just talk. You tried to tear her down, and for what? Because she took a little longer to shop? That's on you, man. John opened his mouth to argue, but faltered under Snoop's intense stare. The silence in the room was palpable, as everyone waited to see what he would do next. Finally, John muttered, Fine. I'll leave. This place isn't worth my time anyway. As he grabbed his cart, the security guard blocked his way. You can leave the cart here, sir, John sneered, abandoning the cart with a harsh shove. He turned to leave, but before stepping out, he paused and looked back at Snoop. You think you're some kind of hero? He spat. Snoop didn't flinch. Nah, he said simply. Just a man who knows right from wrong. The crowd murmured in quiet agreement as John stormed out of the store. His footsteps echoed in the parking lot, the door swinging shut behind him with a loud clang. The security guard turned to Snoop. "Thank you for stepping in. We don't see that often." Snoop nodded, his focus shifting back to Ellen. She stood near the checkout, watching the scene with a quiet sense of relief. "I just did what anyone should do," Snoop replied, "but we all gotta do better." The atmosphere in the store felt lighter as the tension dissipated. People began returning to their shopping, though many glanced at Snoop with newfound respect. Ellen smiled softly as Snoop approached her. "I think it's finally over," she said. He nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "Yeah, for now." The store felt calmer after John's dramatic exit, but the incident was far from over. As the automatic doors closed behind him, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. A young officer stepped out, adjusting his radio as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the store manager quickly approached Snoop and Ellen. "I called the police," the manager explained. "We take harassment seriously here. They'll want to speak to you both." Ellen hesitated, her hands tightening around her cart. "Oh, I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it already is," she said softly. Snoop placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, this isn't about causing trouble. It's about making sure he doesn't do this to anyone else." The officer entered, his sharp gaze sweeping the room before landing on the manager. "We got a report about harassment?" "Yes," the manager said, motioning toward Ellen and Snoop. "This gentleman stood up for her when the man in question caused a scene. He's already left the store, but I can provide a description." Ellen, still reluctant, spoke up. "It was just a misunderstanding," she began, her voice wavering. Snoop gently interrupted. "Ma'am, it wasn't a misunderstanding. That guy crossed a line, and people like him need to be held accountable." The officer nodded. "Can you tell me what happened?" Snoop recounted the incident in clear, steady words, detailing how John had harassed Ellen, blocked her path, and made offensive remarks. Several bystanders, emboldened by Snoop's presence, stepped forward to back up his account. Some even offered video recordings they had taken during the altercation. The officer reviewed the clips on a bystander's phone, his expression tightening as he watched. "This is unacceptable behavior," he said firmly. "We'll follow up with him. Can I have your contact information, ma'am, in case we need further statements?" Ellen hesitated, but eventually nodded, providing her details. "I just hope this doesn't escalate," she said quietly. The officer assured her. "We'll handle this professionally. People like him don't get to act that way without consequences." Snoop watched as the officer headed back to his cruiser, speaking into his radio. He turned to Ellen, his tone soft but resolute. "You didn't deserve any of that, and you don't have to carry it alone." Ellen looked up at him, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You've done more for me than I could ever ask for." Snoop smiled faintly. "It's just the right thing to do." As the police drove away, the store manager approached Ellen again. "We're so sorry for what happened, ma'am. If there's anything we can do to help, please let us know." Ellen nodded graciously, then turned to Snoop. "I think I can finally go home in peace now," she said. "Let's get you there," Snoop replied. Together, they walked toward the exit, leaving behind a store that had just witnessed a powerful lesson in standing up for what's right. As they stepped out of the store, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the parking lot. Ellen adjusted her grip on the cart, her movements slower now as the tension of the day began to subside. Snoop walked beside her, matching her pace, his presence steady and reassuring. When they reached her car, Ellen paused and turned to face him. Her eyes, filled with a mix of relief and gratitude, searched for the right words. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Most people would have just walked away." Snoop gave a small smile, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his hoodie. "Ma'am, you don't have to thank me. Nobody deserves to be treated like that. I just did what anyone should do." Ellen's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the thing," she replied, her tone heavier. "Not everyone does. I've lived long enough to know that sometimes people just look the other way." He nodded, his face serious now. "That's what's gotta change. One person speaks up and it makes a difference. You shouldn't have to fight these battles alone." She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "You've given me hope, young man. Hope that there are still people out there who care enough to act." Snoop chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Young man, huh? Haven't heard that in a while." Ellen laughed softly, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "Well, to me you are, and you've got a good heart." As Snoop helped her load her groceries into the car, a few passers-by nodded at him, clearly recognizing him now. He ignored the attention, focusing on Ellen until her cart was empty. "Drive safe, ma'am," he said as she climbed into her seat. Ellen smiled warmly. "You too, guardian angel." The video of the grocery store confrontation began spreading online within hours. By the time Snoop Dogg returned home, his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, notifications, and calls. Clips from bystanders captured the tense moments, with Snoop's calm yet firm demeanor standing out as he confronted John Sanders. Headlines quickly emerged. "Snoop Dogg stands up against harassment at grocery store." "Snoop Dogg defends elderly woman in viral video." "Celebrity steps in when bystanders stay silent." Social media platforms buzzed with reactions. Some users applauded his actions. "We need more people like Snoop standing up for what's right." A reminder that being a celebrity doesn't mean ignoring the real world. Others reflected on their own inaction. "I've seen situations like this and stayed quiet. Snoop's right. We can't keep doing that. This video made me realize I've been a bystander too many times. Not anymore." Among the comments, Ellen's story began to emerge as well. Someone recognized her from the video and shared a heartfelt post. "This isn't just about Snoop. It's about Ellen, who endured something no one should have to face. Let's remember her strength, too." Snoop shared his own thoughts later that evening, posting a short video message. "This ain't about me being a hero. It's about doing what's right. We've got to stand up for each other because if we don't, who will?" The post gained millions of views within hours, sparking a wider conversation about bystander intervention and respect for others. The hashtag #StepUpNotBack began trending, encouraging people to share their own stories of standing up for others, or their resolve to do so in the future. Meanwhile, the grocery store's management issued a formal statement, condemning John Sanders' behavior and announcing new policies to address harassment in their stores. They thanked Snoop for his actions, calling him an example of integrity and courage. Back at home, Snoop scrolled through the reactions quietly, his expression thoughtful. He was glad the message was spreading, but he also felt the weight of responsibility. "It's not about going viral," he muttered to himself. "It's about making sure people actually change." The police followed up with Ellen to ensure her safety, and she later appeared in a local news interview, her voice steady and proud. "What Snoop did wasn't just for me," she said. "It was for all of us." The incident at the grocery store left a lasting impression, not just on Ellen and Snoop Dogg, but on everyone who had witnessed it. For the bystanders, what started as a moment of hesitation turned into a deep reflection on their own actions, or lack thereof. One young woman, who had been recording the confrontation, posted online, "I froze when I saw that man harassing her. I thought, what can I even do? But seeing Snoop step up made me realize, if he can do it, so can I. Next time, I'll speak up." A store employee who had initially avoided the conflict also shared his thoughts in a staff meeting. I was scared to intervene, but I regret not helping her sooner. That won't happen again. We're trained to stock shelves and assist customers, but we need training for situations like this too. The store responded by announcing a new initiative: mandatory staff training on conflict resolution and anti-harassment measures. Posters were put up near entrances, reminding shoppers and employees alike of the store's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment. For Ellen, the experience left her with a renewed sense of hope. As she returned to her normal routines, she found herself feeling less invisible. Strangers at the store recognized her and offered kind words. "You're stronger than you know," one woman said, bringing tears to Ellen's eyes. Snoop, too, reflected on what had happened. The viral attention was overwhelming, but it reinforced his belief in the importance of standing up for what's right. In a quiet moment with his sister, he admitted, "I didn't do it for the cameras or the fame. I did it because someone needed to." The story sparked conversations across the city and beyond, reminding people of one simple truth: small acts of courage can lead to big changes.